Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenz Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 things that are better than they were 50 years ago. We live in an age in which bad news and negativity reigns, making it easier to overlook the positive things that have taken place in our world over the last half-century. Further, one doesn't need to view the world through rose-colored glasses to see the many things that have transpired over the last few decades are all designed to make our lives easier, safer, and overall less challenging than they were for our forebearers. All one needs to do is compare the present to the fairly recent past to recognize that while there are still things to be depressed about, there are a number of things that have improved dramatically. So what are these positives of which I speak? Well, that's exactly what we're looking at in today's video. Number 10. Automobiles. When one considers the automobiles of yesterday, one can't help but be astonished at the dramatic improvements we see in the vehicles of today. Consider that the average car in the 60s had no seatbelts, airbags, crumple zones, or crash bars. It got maybe 12 miles to the gallon and belched prodigious amounts of toxins into the air. It's not difficult to see how safer, fuel-efficient, and cleaner cars are today. While some might argue that the styling it might have been more interested in the 60s, and no one can deny the mystique of classic muscle cars, it is obvious though today that today's cars are technological wonders compared to these ancestors. When you consider GPS, Bluetooth, and a host of other gadgets that seem to come standard with most cars today, today's vehicles are veritable spaceships when compared to a 60s car. Plus, the selection is almost unlimited, with everything from subcompacts to monster trucks being available to the consumer, whereas back then, a selection was mostly limited to a basic sedan, a station wagon, or a small truck. Further, consumers only had a dozen or so models to choose between back then, whereas today there are literally scores of makes and models to select from, not to mention emerging electric vehicles. Yes, today's cars do cost more than they did 50 years ago, but most vehicles are actually cheaper than their predecessors when one factors into account inflation and the cost of a new car as a percentage of average annual income. Finally, with new and even more astonishing technologies on the drawing boards, the future looks even brighter for the venerable automobile, which I believe will continue to play a big part in the 21st century and possibly beyond. Number 9. Air travel. I know that in a post-9/11 world, air travel is more of a hassle than it was 50 years ago, when one could simply walk through security with barely a whimper, but it can't be denied that travel by air has improved dramatically. First of all, it's cheaper to fly today than at any other time in history. 50 years ago, airfares were set by the Civil Aeronautics Board and could often be expensive. For example, a round-trip airline ticket from Miami to New Orleans costs around $130 in the 1960s, which is about $900 in today's dollars. By comparison, today you can fly that same route for $330, or even cheaper if you look around for a deal. Second, airlines today, they're faster, they're more fuel efficient, and they're more environmentally friendly than at any time in the past, drastically reducing the amount of particulates that they spew into the air, reducing flight duration, and generally making for more comfortable flying. Third, airlines fly to more places than ever before, making practically any point on the planet accessible by air. And finally, air safety has improved dramatically in the last 5 decades. But how much has it improved? Well, according to statisticians at MIT, the death risk for passengers in the United States today is 1 in 45 million flights. In other words, flying has come to be so reliable that a traveler could fly every day for an average of 123,000 years before being in a fatal crash. Compare that to 50 years ago, where there was a year where there were 10 fatal airliner accidents that left 466 people dead. Today, the number is greatly reduced. All things considered, travel by air is still the best value and the safest means of travel that is known to mankind. Number 8. Electronics. Imagine if you were to go back to the 1960s. You would probably be watching a black and white television that gets maybe 4 channels, you'd be listening to AM radio, you'd be playing vinyl records on your hi-fi, and generally making do with a minimum of electronic gadgets. In contrast, today you have iPods, iPhones, personal computers, game stations, massive HD flat-screen TVs with 300 cable channels to choose from, GPS tracking, satellite radio, microwaves, and a whole host of other innovations and devices that were undreamed of 50 years ago. When you consider that your little beat-up 10-year-old piece of junk PC you can't even give away has 1,000 times more computing power than the largest and most expensive computer the 1960s possessed, you can't help but be impressed with the strides that electronics have taken in just the last 30 years alone. Plus, it's extraordinarily cheap, especially if you wait a little while after a new device is introduced, for the price to tumble, as it inevitably will. It's almost scary to imagine where this revolution will take us in the next 50 years, but if the last 50 has been any indication, get ready to be dazzled. Number 7. Human rights. I know there are still despots and tyrants out there who treat their own populace like cattle, with starvation, disease, and poverty still being a concern in many parts of the world, but when compared to what things were like 50 years ago, only the most hardcore pessimist can fail to see the tremendous improvements that have taken place since then. When one considers that homosexuality was considered a treatable mental illness 50 years ago at best, women in positions of power were practically unheard of, and 3/4 of the world's population lived at or below poverty level, one can't help but see improvements. Yes, there is still income inequality in some countries, and yes, the rights of women and minorities are still suppressed in some regions of the world, and yes, poverty remains the norm in some of the poorest countries, but the fact is that for most people, things have improved dramatically. Disease and starvation are far less common, more democracies exist than ever before, and thanks in part to the internet, human rights abuses and atrocities are less tolerated than they were in the past. We're far from a utopian world, but we really are a lot better than we were 50 years ago. Number 6. Frozen dinners. Before the advent of the microwave some 50 years ago, frozen dinners were pretty dismal affairs whose taste was often indistinguishable from the containers that they were packaged in. Plus, it took a good 20 to 30 minutes to heat up most of them, and the selection was very limited and largely unimaginative. Today, in contrast, one can find a veritable smorgasbord of international culinary delights in their freezer that can be prepared in a few minutes, many of which rival the food served in many of the finest restaurants in terms of quality and taste. And, I might add, they are cheaper because restaurant food can be pricey. In fact, so good and easy have frozen dinners become today that they comprise many people's main diet, with most families preparing a meal from pre-packaged frozen dinners as often as 4 times a week. While this has had the unfortunate consequence of making traditional cooking a dying art, it has the benefit in that frozen dinners save the gastrointestinal system of those whose partners or parents are terrible cooks. Further, frozen dinners have also almost single-handedly banished that scourge of the refrigerator and freezer, the dreaded leftover. If that isn't something to rejoice about, well, I don't know what is. Number 5. Movie special effects. CGI in the 60s could be described as primordial at best. There's that example of a rubber guy in a suit stomping a model of Tokyo to stop-motion animation and rubber spiders on strings. Now, at the time, people obviously thought these were pretty cool, but compared to even the weakest CGI effects today, they look pretty lame. Today, thanks to computer-generated imaging, we can make astonishingly convincing dinosaurs, dragons, spaceships, and even entire ancient cities that early special effects wizards could have only dreamt of. Some of the best of this stuff is so real, in fact, that one often has trouble determining reality from good CGI. Unfortunately, as is often the case with all such improvements, there is the downside. Many movies have become so enamored with dazzling effects that they have forgotten how to tell a good story, or they so overdo it that eventually one becomes indifferent and even bored after seeing the same effects a dozen times. Still, when great special effects, good acting, and a compelling story are brought together, as is occasionally the case, the results can truly be remarkable. Number 4. Space travel. In the mid-1960s, America was taking its first unsteady steps into outer space in the little 2-man Gemini spacecraft. They were often unsure whether astronauts would survive the next mission. The spacecraft were small, expensive, and dangerous, but they were necessary steps in man's quest for the stars. Today, in contrast, space travel is almost routine, far more cost-effective in terms of cost per pound of payload, and so simple that even civilian companies are getting into the act by offering to fly rich tourists into orbit for the chance to gaze upon the planet from 50 miles up. Of course, none of this would be possible without the dramatic advances made in electronics and rocketry, and space travel is still a risky business, but compared to what it was 50 years ago, it's no longer that amazing of an accomplishment to put a man, or woman for that matter, into space. Further, this trend will only continue as rocket engines get smaller and more powerful, construction materials become more rugged and cost-effective, and the private sector takes over space in much the same way it took over the airline industry almost a century ago. As a result of all of this, one day our grandchildren will see spaceflight as no more remarkable a feat than an airline flight from New York to Paris seems today. Number 3. Fashion. Fashions, they come and go, but consider that back in the 1960s, things were far more ordinary and less flashy than they are today. Back then, the average Joe and Jill didn't have a huge selection of styles or materials from which to choose. As a result, men commonly wore suits and leather shoes, and women generally wore dresses adorned with bizarre hats of all shapes and sizes. There were not nearly 1,000 different brands and kinds of tennis shoes to choose from. There were only Keds canvas sneakers. Further, patterns were generally limited to striped solids or polka dots, and most clothing was made from cotton, wool, or something in between. In contrast, today the sky's the limit in terms of fashion choices available to both men and women, with all the benefits and consequences that portends. All the colors of the rainbow in any material you can imagine are readily available, and styles are as varied as each person's personality type. The only downside is that today it can be difficult to pick out the women from the men, as clothing styles are largely unisexual. And then there's that nasty epidemic of ugly tattoos and bizarre body piercings. On second thought, maybe fashion is on a downward spiral after all. Number 2. Pollution. I know that concerns over global warming, climate change, the ozone layer and such are all the rage right now, but it is difficult to maintain that things have not improved dramatically over the last 50 years, especially in the West. 50 years ago, smog was a major problem in most major American and European cities, and only promised to get worse as populations continued to grow and more automobiles hit the roads. Further, streams were often dumping grounds for all manner of toxic chemicals, and piles of trash were ubiquitous alongside of roadways. Compare that with today, and almost everything is looking up. Clearly, changing public attitudes, a vigorous recycling infrastructure, and greater environmental awareness have also done much to improve matters. Of course, pollution is still a big problem in some developing countries, in particular China and India, and it is growing worse, at least in some developing nations. But it is only a matter of time before even they are forced to raise air and water quality standards for the good of public safety, portending a cleaner environment in the future. Number 1. World peace. I know many people imagine the world to be one big tinderbox just waiting for a match to be thrown, but the fact is that the world is a far more peaceful place today than it was just 50 years ago. It's really remarkable what a difference a few decades has made. The collapse of communism in Russia and the fall of the Soviet Union, Germany became reunited, the countries of Eastern Europe became free, and the danger of nuclear holocaust became greatly diminished. Further, normalization of relations with Red China has turned that country from a fierce adversary into a major trading partner, while one by one authoritarian regimes have been supplanted by democracies all around the world. Of course, there are still wars, though they tend to be smaller, shorter in duration, and less destructive affairs than those of the past. And, well, terrorism, it remains a threat, but it's hard to deny that the world is not nearly as dangerous a place as it was in the 1960s. Now, all of this can change pretty darn quickly without much notice, but the threats we see from places like North Korea and Iran are mere flea bites compared to the twin dangers of Stalinist Russia and Mao's China just a few decades ago. It's certainly not peace in our time, but we seem to be taking steps in the right direction. So I really hope you liked that video. If you did, do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also over there on the right, a couple of other videos that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one. And as always, thank you for watching.
So you're still here, still watching this video. Maybe you just let it run and you're not actually there anymore. Whatever the case, if you're listening to this, I think you should go check out my new channel. It's called Biographics. It is biographies of notable historic figures, as well as present day people. Let me give you some examples. We got the Queen of England, Vladimir Putin. Those just two people on the world stage. We've also got Elon Musk coming up, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even the first serial killer, H.H. Holmes? Maybe just H.H. Holmes. We look at all sorts of people, longer form, about 20 minutes long, diving into the story of their lives in a similar style to this. It's Biographics. If you like this channel, if you like my other stuff, you're going to like this as well. Biographics, there is a link in the description below. Do go check it out, and please do subscribe.